Hello and welcome to It's No Secret. I'm Kat, and today on the podcast we are joined by Daphne van Oord, Head of Australia and New Zealand at S&P Dow Jones Indices. Daphne has an impressive career spanning over 20 years after graduating with a Bachelor of Science in Economics and History and a Master's degree in Applied Finance. Daphne has worked at many international financial institutions that you may have heard of, including Man Investments, ING Investments, Credit Suisse and Citibank. Daphne manages S&P DJI, you might hear that acronym a few times today, business in the Oz and New Zealand region, including their relationships with two markets you probably have heard of, the ASX and the NZX. She is a huge advocate for getting more women into the financial services industry, and as you may be able to tell by her name, Daphne hails from a Dutch background, however, currently lives in Sydney with her daughter. She's a mad keen horse owner, which we will probably also get into. So, for our Money Moments episodes, we like to just start at the very beginning of our money journeys, as they often lay the foundation for what's to come. So I guess thinking back to kind of childhood days, what's your sort of earliest memory of money or relationship with money growing up as a kid?
Thanks, Kat. So we were slightly unconventional. My father worked for the United Nations. I was born in Pakistan. I grew up in the Middle East, bits of Africa, bits of Asia. So Australia is actually country number 17 for me. But in my dad's career, basically every other year, he was expected to, or encouraged to go back to the quote unquote homeland. Okay. So in our case, that was the Netherlands, which meant having to navigate ferries, trains, autobahns, flights, you name it, just to get from wherever my dad was stationed at the time back to Holland. And he had one very good rule of thumb. Whatever you packed, half that. Whatever you have in your wallet, double that. That was his motto. And we were a family of 5, and that seemed to work well, whether we had to travel from sub-Saharan Africa or whether we were coming across from Cyprus. It didn't really matter. That rule of thumb put us in good stead all the time. And there were a fair few trips, given that my father's career spanned 30 years.
Yeah.
So that was my first, I suppose, introduction about the usefulness of money. And I think I would encapsulate it by saying it gives you options. It's not the route to happiness, but it gives you options.
Yeah. Interesting, because I'm thinking, you know, as a kid then you would have seen various different uses of money in so many different countries. And for a lot of us at a young age, you know, we take on board, I guess, what our parents do with money, but there would have been, lots of cultural influences perhaps at play in terms of understanding different currencies and those sorts of things. Did you, I guess, realize that at the time, or did some of it kind of fly over your head as a child?
No, so money then was very much hard currency.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a time where you didn't have credit cards like you have now. Like
Can't have a Wise card with all the dollars and all the euros.
So the innovation was a traveler's check. Remember those? So I remember distinctly my parents having containers with different currencies, so that the next time we had to travel, they sort of grabbed the
from the pot
dinar or the lira or the shekel, whatever it happened to be, because every time you would exchange money, essentially you lost out. The exchange rates were never in your favor. So we just had these pots of different currency, and we kind of financed our own foreign exchange gambits. And I think I still have coins that hail back to countries that probably don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Just because the thing with hard currency is it's not very fungible.
Yeah. Cool. So, I mean, family of 5 or 5 kids?
Family of 5 being
3 kids. Okay.
Correct.
3 kids, 2 parents, lots of travel. Were your parents strong on, pocket money or earning money to do things when you were young?
So we had the tooth fairy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And because of the countries we generally grew up in, it wasn't the case that there was a lot for a kid to spend on. So we generally would save pocket money towards those trips back to the Netherlands. but what we spent it on was kind of like your heart's desire, Back then it might have been a huge bag of licorice.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't be able to get that in a lot of the countries that we were growing up in. Or, getting tickets to a movie, because movies with English language content weren't readily available. And dare I say it, we're talking about the gender equality that we're seeking today. I think that was embedded back then, because being female in a lot of the countries that I grew up in was a marked disadvantage.
Yes. So question on that, what did your mum do?
She raised us through minefields and food shortages and power outages. She kept us safe and, credit to her.
Yeah, presumably as well in a lot of those countries, no kind of genuine work opportunities for her anyway, in the sense
very
of...
difficult as a foreign national in countries that again didn't value the contribution of women in a sort of occupational capacity beyond wife or mother.
So then I guess, one of the things that kind of jumping ahead, one of the questions that I do have is, we've talked about a lot of the work that you are a very strong advocate for in terms of getting women into finance and, making sure that people have a solid career. And you've done this exceptionally well for yourself in terms of, starting in financial services and moving to where you are now. I believe this is your 10th year at S&P, or coming into your 10th year at S&P Dow Jones. So, where do you think you kind of learnt that from? Were there lessons imparted from either your mum or your dad in terms of the value of work and kind of advocating for yourself? How did they encourage you into university?
So again, given the background, given how generally the female gender was devalued in the countries I grew up, the one thing that helped empower women was if they had some access to education. Yeah. So education became the single factor in a lot of these developing countries that would allow a woman or a girl to essentially escape the expected trajectory of her life. And the more educated families, local families that we would encounter, they would send their daughters overseas and hope that they didn't come back. So I think that was a very pronounced demonstration to me of how education can shift your not just your gears, but shift your whole trajectory in life.
Yeah, absolutely. So then on that part, how did you end up in a Bachelor of Science? I mean, the economics and history is an interesting combination, and then you've moved into financial services.
Especially because I thought I was going to be a vet.
Okay.
Again, drawing on my experience from that background, finance is very international. Had I studied law, I would have been bound by essentially the context of that particular country or jurisdiction or region. I could have looked at international law. I could have looked at, perhaps pursuing a career within the United Nations. But having changed school a lot, I think I was done with that kind of vagabond with a mission type lifestyle. But at the same time, having seen those pots of foreign currency and seen how money gives you options, I was very compelled to explore what the world of investments could mean. The other attraction, to be fair, again, being used to standing out in whatever community I grew up in, I wasn't put out by, it's a man's industry.
Yeah.
In actual fact, I thought, why should they have it all to themselves? And, I guess it might be a slight advantage at the time that I was 6 foot, still am 6 foot. But I certainly thought, this should not be the domain of one gender.
Yes.
And having seen the inequity again in these developing countries of that kind of regime and the kind of disadvantage that imposed on its own community and its experience as a nation, I thought, why not?
Yeah.
If anything, I'm attracted to that because I prefer to disrupt rather than imitate.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you obviously, do your Bachelor of Science, majoring history and economics, and then did you go straight into your master's?
So it was a little bit calculating on the economics and history bit.
Okay.
I could get I did a bit of research, and I could get a Bachelor of Science by doing the joint honours. Meant that I then didn't have to do microeconomics, which looked rather dull. I much preferred to be studying the, industrial evolution of Japan or the history of philosophy than microeconomics.
Yes.
So it was somewhat
calculated on your part. Yeah.
Exactly.
But with the intention knowing that I guess there would be further kind of more applied finance study potentially in order to get into investments.
It wasn't yet clear to me what I would do. It wasn't yet clear to me after I graduated that I would want to pursue a postgraduate degree. But and I think that's good guidance to anyone. When you leave school, what do you know about the real world? Or what do you know about the working world? Unless you've actually paired it with work experience, which, by the way, would be hard because of the study pressures that today's academic environment expects of you.
Yeah.
When you finish high school, what do you really know? So go and do your university degree. But if it's not something you enjoy, don't be afraid to change it.
Yeah.
I think when you're younger, you think, oh my goodness, I'm 18 and everyone around me is 17. It's a disaster. Whereas when you get older, you're like, I don't mind mixing with teens or septuagenarians as long as I'm, enjoying the journey and I'm learning something along the way. So to kind of remind yourself that you're not at a disadvantage if you're a couple of years or even decades older. It's about taking ownership of what you want to do, and if it's something you really don't enjoy, change it.
Yeah.
And these days it's so much more accepted than it used to be.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I love that sentiment because I think, how do you know as an 18-year-old what you want to do for the rest of your life? It's a very unrealistic expectation.
And a relief too, right? It's a relief to know that you don't have to know the next 40 years of your life.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I understand that you started your career then after the study in kind of debt securities and fixed income space. What were those organisations like to work for in the 90s? Obviously a different space potentially to today. So
fixed income is probably the last bastion of boys' club in the finance industry, I think. Sorry for any listeners who are slightly put out by that statement, but fixed income, I don't know. The prospect of winning by just getting your money back with a bit of interest, it's not as exciting as equity or venture capital or alternative investments or even venturing into real assets such as agriculture or forestry. So it was very good grounding because it instills a disciplined approach to how you assess risk. And fixed income is all about risk management because, as I said, the best you can hope for is your money back with some interest. So it did instill that discipline. It also comes with a lot of jargon. So part of understanding finance generally is actually understanding the jargon, which is unfortunate. But once you start practicing the words, the terms, the references, and people, especially when you start out, you might make mistakes. It's a bit like a foreign language. You might make mistakes, but then after a while, it does become like a second language. And then you almost have to check yourself to say, I don't want to perpetuate the jargon. I'm going to try and plain speak what this actually means so that anyone on this bus or in the supermarket queue will understand what I'm talking about.
Know what I'm talking about. Exactly. And I mean, now looking at kind of where your career went, S&P Dow Jones Indices, a very different beast from the likes of, Citibank and some of the investment managers. And I guess some people, depending on where you sit in the finance world, could say a bit of a switch to the other side or the dark side from probably the more active management.
Which side is dark?
Well, that's a good point. But what led you to, I guess, a change? I mean, staying within the industry, but a relatively big change in terms of, I guess, direction of your career.
So I started with debt capital markets. So I started with trading, fixed income, and then, which generally we call the sell side, and then branched out and included equity. Then I did my master's, and it was actually through a study buddy that I was exposed to the buy side, so to the asset management side. And then I had exposure to those two asset classes plus alternatives. And it was through that alternative exposure that I started to become interested in hedge funds, which was my last role before I joined Indices. So what attracted me was the fact that actually indices encompass all stakeholders. Whether you're active, whether you're indexed, whether you're using the services we curate for educational purposes, for narrative, for investment decisions, or for an objective. We basically we built a very broad church.
Yeah.
Cast a wide umbrella. And what makes it interesting for me is actually having some experience with those different agendas, because I've had a part of my career in them, understand where they're coming from, understand the pressures on them, understand the bottlenecks, but also the opportunities, and then ultimately striving to come up with a win-win, which might be, a throwback to my United Nations youth, trying to find a compromise or a solution that's a win-win, and everyone essentially is in a better
happy
position than they were before.
Yeah.
But what is really intriguing about indices is that the more you dig, the more you find, the more you can engage people with data that's meaningful, the more insights they can gain, the more the mystery disappears in terms of whether it's ESG objectives, whether it's achieving gender equality in boardrooms, whether it's having a less volatile portfolio.
Yeah. Just because it's a fun question, and I think, sometimes we like to give some of our younger listeners a reality check. Daphne, do you remember what your starting salary was in the finance world in the 90s?
Not enough.
For the workload involved, or just the general BS that you had to put up with?
No. Well, put it this way. When you're at university, you don't earn a lot. But no one around you is earning much either.
Yeah.
And to supplement my allowance those days, I used to work in the student union bar, because that way I could hang out with my friends but be paid for it.
Yeah. Perfect outcome.
I was never very good with large quantities of purple nasties. I don't know if that concoction of beer and blackcurrant syrup.
Oh, goodness. That sounds terrible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was terrible. But, everyone's kind of in the same boat. You're all paupers. But then when you start working, and then you have to think about, what are you wearing, and getting to where you need to go. And generally speaking, you need to go at peak hour like everyone else, and there tends to be a higher price to be paid for that.
Yep.
Suddenly money takes on a different meaning. And I remember distinctly thinking, phew, I have a job, but am I really better off? And that's why I was saying earlier, it doesn't necessarily lead to happiness.
Yes.
But it does give you options.
Yeah.
Will I eat today?
Will
I eat a jacket potato today, or will I, treat myself to going out with my friends?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and I mean, how have you found, you said at the start, you've always been comfortable being perhaps the one a little bit out of place, or the anomaly in kind of a situation given
that
on
was
your
normal.
upbringing.
Yeah,
exactly.
That was kind of the given.
Exactly. And I'm going to make some broad assumptions that, in probably the early days, you were one of very few females working in some of these teams. How did you find navigating any conversations around pay at that time, particularly being young, because it's new to everyone, and how has that maybe changed over the course of your career?
Idea.
Yeah.
To be completely honest, I assumed that I was on the same pay as another university graduate, but I have no means of corroborating that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty much every graduate starting work was struggling with, making all the ends meet and still looking presentable at work and all of that.
Yep. Is there a moment in your career where you felt like, I think, a lot of people have like, okay, it's starting to change. I'm making it a little bit from a salary point of view. I also feel like I know what I'm doing. And is there a distinct moment in time or a certain age where you recall that kind of transition happening?
Yeah, when you start to realize that, it takes a little bit of time to create a buffer, and then that buffer starts giving you some confidence. But when you start thinking beyond getting through the month and being able to do the things you want to do with your friends and colleagues, and in Europe it's a little bit easier because travel anywhere is easier.
Yeah.
You just have to get on a train and you step out in a different country. But knowing that you had those options, again, you could fund those options and enjoy without worrying about, do I have enough to pay my phone bill and my rent and, incidentals that come along with wearing corporate attire.
Yes.
These days, I think it's a lot easier. Like post-COVID, I struggled to find anyone wearing a tie. And similarly, I think high heels, they've kind of had their day.
Yes.
Whereas back then, there was kind of a
whole separate uniform that you needed. Yeah. Not any crossover between your day-to-day wardrobe. And
there was no tax deduction for pantyhose that had runs in them.
Yeah. Oh, too good.
Ladders, I think you call them.
Yeah, ladders. Yeah. Cool. So I guess kind of fast forwarding and thinking about, now coming in, as I said, your 10th year at the indices team, a ton has changed, I can imagine, in the index investing world. And a lot of our listeners will know that we are huge fans of passive investing and we talk about all the things that S&P do. And I guess, obviously the work then that Kernel does and the funds and why we love passive investing so much. But in terms of, I guess, things that have changed and what you've just observed of that world in the last 10 years, is there anything that kind of stands out as being like, wow, this is really, on an upward trajectory or just is totally new or something I didn't expect when I started 10 years ago?
I think there was already momentum building in what we describe as non-market cap indices, and that means building index rules, which, let me take a step back, building rules-based portfolios, because that's all what an index is, rules-based portfolios. So building rules around objectives that previously were the sole domain of what we call the active management community. Yeah. So whether it was objectives for growth versus value or volatility, momentum, and now increasingly, of course, we're talking about sustainability, carbon efficiency, carbon mitigation, and just around the corner, we're going to be building indices that embrace biodiversity, which is, I think, super exciting. So in the 10 years, what has certainly been a game changer has been the access to quality data in what might have traditionally been construed as purely scientific fields.
Right.
So weather patterns, species proliferation or endangerment, temperatures of the sea, things that were previously maybe the domain for
people not in financial services.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But with that is also the rise of AI.
Yes.
So computational advancements in machine learning.
Yep.
I mean, that no one in sort of dinner table settings would be talking about robo advice. And now suddenly it's bandied about as though it's
all the time normal. Yep.
Correct.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I'm assuming that it's just, as the world has changed, we have more data and the data is just more accurate, and indices are ultimately a data company, would you say, to kind of the layman?
I think it's a consequence of engaging with our clients. And again, referring back to what appealed to me about SPDJI was the fact that we can embrace a very broad community of stakeholders.
Yeah.
So some of our stakeholders are tertiary educators, research departments. So if they're asking, how would you solve for this? Here is data.
Yeah.
This is what we're trying to figure out. How would you solve for that? Again, we're applying it in a finance world, but if you think about it, being able to interpret data is not quarantined to finance at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So data scientists is the domain for many different disciplines.
Yeah. 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 Fascinating. It's an exciting space.
So put it this way, I think we'd be just as eligible as a prospective employer for someone who's come from a computing science background as someone who's come from a comparative literature background.
Right.
Because you're looking for ways to make sense of a lot of noise.
Yeah. A lot of information. And how big is the team or the indices team around the world now?
We seem to be getting bigger all the time. We've recently acquired a power in the fixed income field in credit indices. So that's IHS Market.
Yep.
So I don't want to put a number to it because I'm sure I'm not up to date, but it is increasing, but not so much on the client interfacing side because we tend to have nurtured long-term relationships with our clients and we tend to derive a lot of job satisfaction as a consequence. So I have colleagues who have been with the firm for more than 10 years.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, I know you have some team members that have very long tenures across that business and it's impressive.
And I think it's testament to the scenario I just shared, which is the industry is evolving more quickly at the moment and there are multiple objectives that we're asked to partner on to solve.
Yeah.
So that keeps it interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine, even after 10 years.
What, 10 years?
Nice. Well, I guess to pivot just a little bit and wrap up in the kind of next couple of minutes, I said at the start that you have a daughter and you're obviously a mad horse keen family. What are you trying to impart on her, I guess, about money and investing, and how aware is she of what you do in the investment world?
Horses are a bad investment.
I was going to say, there are a lot of lessons going on there other than the horse riding?
The lesson with horses is twofold. One, you always need a plan B and a plan C because you're dealing with large beings that can be incredibly fragile or opinionated. So you need the plan B and the plan C as opposed to thinking, oh my God, I won't be able to do this. It's a catastrophe. Let's all go home.
Yep.
No, you might be on the road pulling a float and you've got to change a tire or whatever it is. So it teaches you to be very practically present.
Okay.
And that's good training for teenagers who tend to be not particularly present, to think about, okay, what do I need to pre-pack? What do I need to prepare? And how do we resolve this particular challenge?
Yep.
And it's also incredibly collaborative insofar as if you see anyone else in your sport in trouble, you'll go out and give them a hand because ultimately, we might be doing different equestrian sports, but we all do it because of our love of horses.
Yeah.
So, having a common interest and finding your friends through that hobby or pursuit,
Yep.
I think that's a valuable lesson to impart to a young adult.
Yeah.
And your second question?
Investing and money. How are those lessons going?
It's not buying computer games.
Yeah.
Or not solely in buying computer games. So this might come across a little bit unexpected, but there is value in putting some money towards investments that you don't entirely understand. And the reason I say, and I'm not saying put your house on those things. That's not what I'm saying. But if there is an area of the market, or if there's a strategy that you've heard of and you're not quite sure, how it all fits together, there's nothing like putting a little bit of money in that, because that will vest you quite literally and make you aware, and you will start absorbing experience, and it'll impart some knowledge. You will either decide this is not me, and you may have lost all your money and that's it, or you can then divert your money somewhere else. But it's a bit like, if you were planning to buy a certain car or a certain brand of something, once you have that in your mind, you see it everywhere. It's a little bit like that with investing. Like once you just put a little bit of your
money
portfolio
somewhere
in there, it makes you
pay attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm very lucky. My daughter is very conscientious. So sometimes I have to encourage her to say, well, if you're interested in that, put something towards that.
Yeah.
And she's like, but Mom, it's so risky. And I'm like, yes, but there is something to be learned from that. And so that she understands too that you don't, why do you apportion your portfolio a certain way? Why do you risk budget? Why would you embark on a strategy that looks to have a core satellite approach? What are the ups and downs associated with that?
Yes. Yeah. Is there one particular investment that she's been, kind of taken her fancy, or that has gone well, I guess, in her eyes?
For at this stage, it's about being conscious about indexed solutions.
Yeah.
Whether that's in a listed form, such as an ETF, or an unlisted form, and being aware of the power thereof in terms of diversification, transparency, value for money, versus the alternative to that.
Yeah.
So, that, and because she is also a critical thinker, how much of the spin, or how does the spin compare between an entity that provides indexed solutions versus one that does not? And she has some, I think, astute observations. So in terms of, really what's out there, I think our kids are lucky and unlucky. They've inherited a planet in crisis, but I think they also inherit a no excuse mandate to fix it.
Yeah.
Whereas our generation, we were a little bit wishy-washy.
One last question. I mean, juggling a successful career, people throw around the balance term a lot, and, parenting, as I've talked about on the show a few times, now that I'm very early into that journey, there's no easy kind of fix. Is there anything, I guess, that you have found that has made it work for you in the course of your career?
The revelation has been more recent. So I would think that whether you were in New Zealand or in Australia, you suddenly were sharing the dining table. At one end, you were having Zoom business calls, and on the other hand, you had children trying to follow their lesson. And I said it more than once. It wasn't a case of working from home. Oftentimes, I thought I was living at work. And I still struggle with that at times, finding that balance, particularly past the pandemic, because work was the only thing that seemed predictable and a haven of some sort of sanity, like some sort of predictability. If I respond to this email and we get this sorted, then that is one less issue. Whereas, you turned on the news, read the paper, or looked at television, and it was yet another thing. So I have to profess I'm still weaning myself off that hyper productivity.
Yep.
And I think there are folk like that as well. But what I have really appreciated, thanks to the pandemic, is that people realize children are joint responsibility. Doesn't matter what gender you are, they are responsibility. There's no more, I've got to go home because I've got to babysit. And it's like, but they're your kids.
Yeah.
You don't babysit your kids. You parent your kids.
Yes.
So I think there's been a real leveler between parents, realization of the
true workload or the true, I guess, involvement required.
The relentlessness of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, whether it's a baby or whether it's an adolescent or a teenager.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop. It just changes.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop. But it's not just a domain of one parent, one person.
Yeah.
And I think it's been a reveal for potentially a lot of men, a reveal for potentially a lot of women. And as a result, I think that striving for work-life balance has gained some authenticity. So yes, the word or the term was bandied around a lot, but now I think people really understand what does that mean, because everyone's been in that boat.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it feels like it was only yesterday that we were having dinner just pre-COVID in, the bliss of February 2020 before things started to turn pear-shaped. And a lot has happened since then in terms of, I guess, the growth of Kernel and various different things, and also all the work that the Indices team are doing. So thank you very much, Daphne, for coming on the show and sharing with us.
Pleasure.
I'm sure we'll be back here at some point and, there will be other lessons. Hopefully no more 3-year pandemics, but hey.
I was just going to say,
I know.
no more pandemics.
Yeah.
I think we're done for at least a century.
Great. A grandchildren's problem then. But yeah, thank you very much for taking the time and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Kat.
No worries.